On the night of July 24th, 1944, at 11:47 p.m., Sergeant James O'Reilly crouched behind a makeshift barricade on the Orote Peninsula of Guam, watching empty sake bottles glint in the moonlight as they rolled down the muddy slopes toward his position. The 26-year-old Marine from Boston had survived Guadalcanal and Bougainville, but nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing through his field glasses. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stumbling through the rain, some barely able to stand, yet all moving directly toward the American lines. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Moore, had warned the 22nd Marines to expect a counterattack, but this looked less like a military assault and more like a drunken mob. The Japanese had been cut off for weeks, their supplies dwindling, their positions overrun one by General Roy Geiger's relentless advance across the island. Standard military doctrine suggested they would retreat, regroup, or surrender. Instead, General Takeshi Takashina had done something unprecedented. He had ordered his men to drink themselves into a frenzy and charge straight into the teeth of American firepower. O'Reilly watched as Corporal Keiji Ota and hundreds of other Japanese soldiers began their stumbling advance, many singing war songs, others vomiting from the alcohol, all of them carrying bayonets and rifles, with the desperate fury of men who had already accepted death. The Marines had 26,000 artillery shells ready to fire, naval guns offshore, and machine gun nests positioned every 50 yards along the ridge. The Japanese had sake, bayonets, and the kind of fanatical courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. As the first wave of drunken soldiers emerged from the tree line, screaming and charging uphill through the mud, O'Reilly realized he was about to witness either the most heroic last stand in military history or the most devastating slaughter the Pacific War had ever seen. The morning of July 24th had begun like any other on Guam, with the steady percussion of artillery fire echoing across the island as Major General Roy Geiger's 3rd Marine Division continued their methodical advance toward the remaining Japanese strongholds. Sergeant James O'Reilly had spent the dawn hours cleaning his Browning automatic rifle, checking ammunition supplies, and studying the terrain maps that Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Moore had distributed to squad leaders the night before. The maps showed their current positions along the Orote Peninsula, a finger of land jutting into the Philippine Sea that had become the focal point of the American assault on the island. O'Reilly's squad occupied a series of hastily constructed foxholes and machine gun nests, carved into the muddy slopes overlooking the approaches to Fonte Ridge. The position offered clear fields of fire down into the valley, where intelligence reports suggested the remnants of General Takeshi Takashina's 29th Division were making their final preparations for what everyone assumed would be either a retreat or a surrender. The Japanese had been cut off from resupply for nearly 3 weeks, their defensive positions systematically destroyed by naval bombardment and close air support from Marine Corsairs operating out of the recently captured airfield at Orote. The tactical situation appeared straightforward to the Marines. Takashina's forces were trapped between the advancing American units and the sea, with no viable escape routes and dwindling supplies of ammunition and food. Standard military doctrine suggested that any competent commander would either attempt a fighting withdrawal to more defensible terrain or begin negotiations for surrender. The Japanese, however, had shown little inclination toward either option throughout the Pacific campaign, preferring to fight to the last man rather than accept the dishonor of capture. As the day progressed, Marine patrols reported unusual activity in the Japanese positions. Radio intercepts suggested increased communication between enemy units, and forward observers noted what appeared to be gatherings of soldiers in areas that had been relatively quiet for days. More puzzling were the reports of singing and shouting coming from the Japanese lines, sounds that seemed inconsistent with the preparations for either a retreat or a last-ditch defensive stand. Lieutenant Colonel Moore had called a briefing for company commanders at 1600 hours, gathering his officers in a dugout command post that offered protection from the intermittent Japanese mortar fire that still fell on American positions. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant named Patterson, who had joined the unit only weeks before the Guam operation, spread aerial reconnaissance photographs across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates. The photographs revealed something that challenged conventional expectations about Japanese defensive tactics. Instead of the expected withdrawal of forces toward more defensible positions, the images showed what appeared to be a concentration of troops in forward areas, with supply parties moving toward the front lines rather than away from them. More significantly, the photographs captured images of what intelligence analysts believed were supply drops of sake and other alcoholic beverages being distributed to Japanese units. Moore studied the photographs with the methodical attention that had earned him recognition as one of the most effective battalion commanders in the 3rd Marine Division. His experience at Bougainville had taught him to expect the unexpected from Japanese commanders, who often employed tactics that defied Western military logic. The distribution of alcohol to frontline troops, however, represented something entirely new in his experience of Pacific warfare. The implications were troubling. Alcohol could serve multiple purposes. In military operations, it could be used to boost morale among demoralized troops, to numb soldiers to the prospect of death in a hopeless situation, or as part of ceremonial preparations for what the Japanese called a Banzai charge. The latter possibility was the most concerning, as it suggested that Takashina might be preparing for a massive frontal assault rather than the expected withdrawal or defensive stand. Moore's tactical assessment of the American position revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities. The Marines held the high ground along the ridgeline, with excellent fields of fire covering the approaches from the Japanese positions. Artillery support was abundant, with the 105th Howitzer Battalion positioned to deliver devastating firepower on any attacking force. Naval gunfire support remained available from destroyers positioned offshore, capable of delivering precision strikes with 5-inch guns that could reach any point on the peninsula. The primary concern was the dispersion of Marine units across a front that stretched nearly 2 miles from the coast to the inland hills. While the positions were mutually supporting and connected by communication lines, a massive assault force could potentially overwhelm individual strongpoints before reinforcements could be brought to bear. The solution lay in the careful coordination of firepower and the discipline of Marines who had learned through bitter experience in previous island campaigns how to hold their positions against seemingly overwhelming odds. As evening approached, the reports from forward listening posts became increasingly ominous. The sounds of singing and shouting from Japanese positions had intensified, accompanied by what observers described as the breaking of glass and the distinctive sounds of military equipment being prepared for combat. Radio intercepts suggested that Japanese commanders were issuing final instructions to their units, with references to honor, sacrifice, and the emperor that typically preceded suicidal attacks. O'Reilly received his final briefing from his company commander as darkness began to settle over the peninsula. The Marines were to maintain full alert throughout the night, with half the men awake and ready for combat at all times. Artillery coordinates had been pre-registered on all likely avenues of approach, and illumination rounds were prepared to turn night into day at the first sign of enemy movement. The message was clear. Whatever Takashina was planning, the Marines would be ready. The rain began shortly after 2200 hours, turning the already muddy terrain into a treacherous landscape of slippery slopes and flooded foxholes. O'Reilly pulled his poncho tighter and checked his weapon one final time, listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in the darkness below, 3,000 Japanese soldiers were making their final preparations for what would become one of the largest Banzai charges in Pacific war history. The first indication that General Takashina's assault had begun came not from the expected sounds of organized military movement, but from the chaotic noise of hundreds of drunken voices rising through the rain-soaked darkness at 23:42 hours. Corporal Keiji Ota stumbled forward through the mud with his bayonet fixed, the sake burning in his throat as he tried to focus on the American positions ahead. The alcohol had been distributed 2 hours earlier with explicit instructions from his company commander. Drink everything, charge when the whistle sounds, and die with honor for the Emperor. O'Reilly heard them before he saw them, a growing cacophony of war songs, screams, and the distinctive sound of hundreds of men moving through thick vegetation without any attempt at stealth. The Marine forward observer in the valley floor had already called in the first illumination round, and when the magnesium flare burst overhead, it revealed a sight that defied every tactical manual O'Reilly had studied. Japanese soldiers were emerging from their positions in waves, many stumbling over the rough terrain, others supporting comrades who could barely stand, all of them moving directly toward the Marine lines with fixed bayonets and rifles held high. Lieutenant Colonel Moore received the first contact report at 23:45 hours and immediately ordered all artillery batteries to commence firing on pre-registered coordinates. The 105th Howitzer Battalion responded within 90 seconds, sending 105mm shells screaming over the heads of the forward Marine positions to explode among the advancing Japanese formations. Each shell contained nearly 5 pounds of high explosive, designed to create a killing radius of 50 yards against personnel in the open. The artillery barrage should have stopped the assault before it gained momentum, but the Japanese continued advancing through the explosions with a determination that shocked even veteran Marines who had witnessed Banzai charges at Saipan and Tinian. Ota pushed forward with his remaining squad members, stepping over the bodies of soldiers who had been torn apart by shell fragments. His alcohol-clouded mind focused only on reaching the enemy positions. The sake had dulled his fear, but also impaired his ability to take cover or respond to the tactical situation unfolding around him. Marine machine gunners opened fire with their water-cooled Browning M1917 guns as the Japanese assault waves closed to within 400 yards of the American positions. Each machine gun could fire up to 600 rounds per minute, creating interlocking fields of fire that should have made any frontal assault impossible. The Japanese, however, continued their advance despite casualties that would have broken any sober military formation. Empty sake bottles rolled down the slopes ahead of the attackers, glinting in the light of continuous illumination rounds that turned the battlefield into a hellish theater of destruction. The 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing had positioned night fighters on standby at the Orote airfield, and within minutes of the initial contact, F-4U Corsairs were circling overhead with full loads of ammunition and napalm. The pilots could see the entire assault unfolding beneath them, thousands of Japanese soldiers advancing across open ground in tight formations that offered perfect targets for strafing runs. The 1st Corsair dove at 23:58 hours, its 650 caliber machine guns cutting swaths through the advancing infantry while napalm canisters created walls of fire that should have channeled the attack away from the main Marine positions. Instead of retreating or seeking cover, many Japanese soldiers ran directly through the flames, their uniforms and equipment burning as they continued their advance with bayonets fixed. Ota felt the heat wash over him as he passed through one of the napalm fires, the alcohol in his system making him less sensitive to the pain of burns on his hands and face. His rifle had become too hot to hold properly, but he continued forward with the bayonet extended, focused on a Marine machine gun position that seemed to be getting closer with each stumbling step. The naval gunfire support arrived at midnight exactly, with the destroyer USS O'Brien beginning a systematic bombardment of the Japanese assembly areas using 5-inch guns loaded with high-capacity shells. Each shell weighed 54 pounds and could penetrate several feet of earth before exploding, creating craters 20 feet across and sending deadly fragments in all directions. The destroyer's fire control radar allowed for precise targeting even in darkness, but the Japanese assault had already advanced beyond the safety margins for naval gunfire, forcing the ship's gunners to shift their fire to suspected reserve positions. Moore coordinated the defensive fire from his command post, maintaining radio contact with artillery observers, naval gunfire control, and Marine aircraft while tracking the progress of the assault against his forward positions. The reports coming in defied conventional military logic. Japanese soldiers were advancing directly into concentrated firepower without attempting to use cover, concealment, or tactical formations that might have given them some chance of success. The assault appeared to be driven entirely by alcohol-fueled fanaticism rather than any coherent military strategy. The 22nd Marines held their positions along the ridgeline, with each company maintaining interlocking fields of fire that created killing zones in front of their foxholes. O'Reilly's squad had expended nearly half of their ammunition in the first 10 minutes of the assault, but the Japanese continued advancing through casualties that mounted into the hundreds within the first hour. The sergeant could see individual attackers clearly now, many of them swaying as they ran, some falling without being hit by American fire, others continuing to advance even after taking wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Ota reached within 50 yards of the Marine positions before a burst from O'Reilly's Browning automatic rifle caught him across the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the mud beside a dozen other Japanese soldiers who had fallen in the same deadly ground. The corporal's last conscious thought was confusion about why the sake had not made him brave enough to reach the American positions, unaware that his alcohol-impaired coordination had made him an easy target for Marines who had been trained to shoot accurately under combat conditions. The assault continued with fresh waves of Japanese soldiers emerging from positions that the Marines had believed were already destroyed by artillery fire. Intelligence estimates suggesting that Takashina commanded fewer than 1,500 effective combat troops proved dramatically wrong as thousands of soldiers continued their advance through firepower that should have stopped any conventional military formation. The general had concentrated every remaining man under his command for this single desperate gamble, turning the 29th Division's final battle into a massive human wave assault fueled by sake and desperation. The full weight of American industrial firepower descended upon the Japanese assault at 00:15 hours, when Lieutenant Colonel Moore authorized the firing of all available artillery batteries simultaneously. The 105th Howitzer Battalion had been joined by the 12th Marine Artillery Regiment, bringing the total number of guns to 48 pieces ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to 155mm long toms capable of hurling 95-pound shells to a range of 14 miles. The coordinated barrage created a continuous thunder that could be heard across the entire island, with shells falling at a rate of 12 per minute across the 2-mile front, where Japanese soldiers continued their advance. Moore had calculated that the enemy assault represented approximately 3,000 men advancing in waves across terrain that offered no natural cover from artillery fire. Standard doctrine called for 1 artillery shell per 10 square yards to achieve effective suppression of infantry in the open, meaning that the Marine gunners needed to deliver approximately 30,000 rounds to saturate the entire assault area. The ammunition expenditure seemed excessive by conventional standards, but the Japanese showed no signs of breaking off their attack, despite casualties that had already exceeded 50% of their initial strength. The USS Tennessee had joined the naval bombardment at 0020 hours, bringing 14-inch guns to bear on Japanese reserve positions identified by aerial reconnaissance. Each shell from the battleship's main battery weighed 1,500 pounds and could penetrate 26 feet of reinforced concrete before exploding. The massive projectiles created craters 40 feet across and could be felt as seismic shocks by Marines positioned over a mile away from the impact points. The battleship's fire control system allowed for precise targeting using radar and aerial spotting, but the Japanese assault had advanced so close to American positions that naval gunfire had to be shifted to areas well behind the immediate battlefield. O'Reilly watched through his rifle scope as Japanese soldiers continued emerging from positions that should have been obliterated by the bombardment. Many of the attackers appeared to be moving in small groups rather than organized military formations, stumbling through shell craters and over the bodies of their fallen comrades with the single-minded determination of men who had accepted death as inevitable. The sergeant could see sock bottles scattered across the battlefield, some still intact but most shattered by shell fragments or small arms fire. The Marine Corsairs had been reinforced by additional squadrons from the escort carriers offshore, bringing the total number of aircraft over the battlefield to 24 fighter bombers loaded with napalm, fragmentation bombs, and 50 caliber ammunition. Each Corsair carried nearly 3,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition and could make multiple strafing runs before returning to rearm and refuel. The pilots reported that Japanese soldiers were continuing to advance even after being hit by napalm, with some attackers running forward while their uniforms and equipment burned. Major General Roy Geiger monitored the battle from his command post 3 miles behind the front lines, receiving reports from subordinate commanders and coordinating the massive firepower response to Takashina's assault. Intelligence estimates had suggested that the Japanese possessed fewer than 2,000 effective combat troops, but the continuous waves of attackers indicated that Takashina had committed every available man to the assault, including service personnel, wounded soldiers, and headquarters staff who normally would not participate in frontline combat operations. The expenditure of ammunition reached unprecedented levels as the battle continued into its second hour. The 22nd Marines had fired over 40,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, with individual riflemen going through their basic load of 80 rounds within the first 30 minutes of combat. Ammunition resupply became critical as Marines began rationing their remaining cartridges for the closest targets, allowing some Japanese soldiers to advance closer to the American positions than tactical doctrine recommended. The Japanese assault began to fragment into smaller groups as casualties mounted and the effects of alcohol wore off among the surviving attackers. Many soldiers found themselves alone or in pairs, separated from their units and disoriented by the continuous bombardment and the darkness broken only by the harsh light of illumination rounds. Some continued advancing toward the Marine positions with fixed bayonets, while others sought cover in shell craters or behind the bodies of fallen comrades, apparently sobering enough to realize the futility of their situation. Moore ordered his reserve company to move forward at 0130 hours to reinforce the forward positions where Japanese soldiers had managed to penetrate the outer defensive perimeter. The reserve Marines advanced through communication trenches that connected the various strong points, carrying additional ammunition and medical supplies for the defenders who had been engaged in continuous combat for nearly 2 hours. The reinforcements brought the total Marine strength in the immediate battle area to approximately 800 men facing an estimated 1,500 remaining Japanese attackers. The battlefield had become a charnel house of destroyed equipment and human remains scattered across the muddy slopes leading up to the Marine positions. Artillery shells had torn apart entire assault formations, leaving craters filled with fragments of weapons, equipment, and bodies that made movement difficult, even for the Marines defending from prepared positions. The continuous rain had mixed with blood and mud to create a slippery surface that made footing treacherous for both attackers and defenders. Individual acts of desperate courage emerged from the chaos as some Japanese soldiers managed to reach the marine wire obstacles despite the overwhelming firepower directed against them. A few attackers succeeded in penetrating the outer defenses before being killed in hand-to-hand combat with marine defenders who had been trained in close-quarters battle techniques developed during previous island campaigns. These isolated penetrations represented the closest the assault came to achieving any tactical success against the American positions. The ammunition expenditure reached levels that strained even the extensive logistics system supporting the 3rd Marine Division. Artillery batteries reported firing over 8,000 rounds in the first 2 hours of combat, requiring emergency resupply from ammunition dumps located several miles inland. The naval vessels offshore had expended over 500 rounds of 5-inch ammunition and were beginning to draw on reserve supplies intended for future operations. Aircraft ammunition consumption exceeded planning estimates by 300%, forcing air commanders to prioritize targets and restrict pilots to single strafing runs to conserve rounds for continuing operations. Takashina's gamble had committed his entire remaining force to a single desperate assault that showed no signs of achieving breakthrough despite the massive casualties being inflicted by American firepower. The general had calculated that surprise and fanaticism might overcome the material disadvantage facing his troops, but the reality of modern industrial warfare proved that individual courage, even when amplified by alcohol, could not overcome the coordinated application of overwhelming firepower by a well-trained and well-equipped military force. The first gray light of dawn on July 25th revealed a battlefield that defied the imagination of even veteran Marines who had witnessed the carnage at Tarawa and Saipan. O'Reilly climbed out of his foxhole at 0530 hours and found himself looking across a landscape transformed into a wasteland of shell craters, destroyed equipment, and thousands of Japanese bodies scattered across the muddy slopes leading up to the American positions. The rain had stopped during the night, but the ground remained saturated with water mixed with blood, creating a treacherous surface that made movement difficult as Marines began advancing to secure the battlefield. Empty sake bottles lay everywhere among the Japanese dead, some still clutched in the hands of soldiers who had died mid-charge, others scattered across the ground where they had been dropped or shattered by artillery fragments. The bottles told a story that military historians would struggle to understand. An entire division had been ordered to drink themselves into a state of intoxication before launching what amounted to a mass suicide attack against positions that any sober assessment would have recognized as impregnable. O'Reilly counted over 40 bottles within a 50-yard radius of his position, suggesting that the alcohol distribution had been systematic and comprehensive across all Japanese units. Lieutenant Colonel Moore ordered a careful advance by his companies to establish the extent of Japanese casualties and to identify any surviving enemy soldiers who might pose a continued threat. The Marines moved forward in tactical formations despite the apparent complete destruction of the attacking force, maintaining proper spacing and covering each other as they advanced through the field of bodies. Combat experience had taught them that wounded enemy soldiers sometimes continued fighting with concealed weapons, and the alcohol factor introduced an unknown variable into the tactical equation. The scale of the destruction became apparent as Marine patrols reached areas that had been under continuous artillery bombardment throughout the night. Individual shell craters contained the remains of entire Japanese squads, with equipment and human fragments scattered across areas the size of basketball courts. Artillery observers estimated that approximately 26,000 shells had been fired in support of the defensive action, creating a density of firepower that exceeded anything previously recorded in Pacific operations. The 105th Howitzer Battalion alone had expended over 12,000 rounds, requiring emergency resupply efforts that continued throughout the early morning hours. Medical corpsmen moving across the battlefield found evidence that contradicted every assumption about how alcohol affected combat performance. Many Japanese soldiers had continued advancing with wounds that should have been immediately incapacitating, apparently numbed to pain by the sake they had consumed before the assault. Others had died with their weapons still fixed in the bayonet position, having maintained their grip on rifles even after taking multiple hits from machine gun fire. The alcohol had clearly affected their ability to take cover or respond tactically to the defensive fire, but it had also enabled some soldiers to continue fighting with injuries that would have stopped sober men. The emotional toll on the Marine defenders began to manifest as the full scope of the carnage became visible in daylight. O'Reilly found himself staring at the body of a Japanese soldier who appeared to be no more than 16 years old, still clutching a photograph of what might have been his family alongside an empty sake bottle. The sergeant had participated in the defense of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and had witnessed the aftermath of numerous Banzai charges, But the scale and senseless waste of human life in this assault exceeded anything in his previous experience. Corporal Jackson from 2nd Squad discovered what appeared to be a Japanese officer's diary among the personal effects scattered across the battlefield. The document, written in characters that none of the Marines could read, would later be translated by intelligence personnel and would reveal the planning that had gone into the alcohol distribution. The Japanese command had calculated that SAC would overcome the natural human instinct for self-preservation that might cause soldiers to seek cover or retreat when faced with overwhelming firepower. The strategy had succeeded in creating a human wave assault of unprecedented fanaticism, but it had also ensured that the attack would continue even after any reasonable chance of success had been eliminated. The ammunition expenditure reports compiled by Marine logistics personnel revealed the industrial scale of firepower that had been brought to bear against Takashina's assault. In addition to the artillery bombardment, Marine infantry had fired over 60,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, exhausting the basic loads of ammunition carried by individual soldiers and requiring emergency resupply during the height of the battle. Machine gun crews had fired over 100,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, heating their weapons to the point where several guns had to be taken out of action for barrel changes. Naval gunfire support had contributed an additional 800 rounds of 5 and 14-inch shells, with the USS Tennessee alone firing over 200 rounds from its main battery. The battleship's 14-inch shells had been used to attack Japanese assembly areas and suspected command posts located beyond the range of Marine artillery. Each shell represented a significant expenditure of resources, with the total cost of the naval bombardment exceeding the value of most military equipment that the Japanese possessed on the entire island. The Marine casualties from the defensive action were remarkably light considering the scale and duration of the assault. 14 Marines had been killed and 37 wounded, primarily from Japanese soldiers who had managed to penetrate the outer defensive perimeter before being eliminated in close-quarters combat. The casualty ratio of approximately 1 American for every 70 Japanese exceeded anything recorded in previous Pacific operations, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated defensive firepower against mass infantry assault regardless of the attacker's level of fanaticism. Intelligence analysis of captured documents and prisoner interrogations would later reveal that General Takashina had committed virtually his entire remaining force to the assault, including headquarters personnel, service troops, walking wounded from field hospitals, and even some civilian laborers who had been pressed into combat roles. The decision represented a complete abandonment of conventional military strategy in favor of a desperate gamble that might have broken the American siege through sheer shock and overwhelming numbers. The alcohol distribution had been calculated to overcome rational fear and enable soldiers to advance into certain death with the kind of dedication that Japanese military culture associated with ultimate loyalty to the emperor. The battlefield cleanup would require several days as Marine engineers used bulldozers and explosives to create mass burial sites for the Japanese dead. The logistics of disposing of over 3,000 bodies in the tropical heat presented health hazards that required immediate attention, while the recovery of abandoned weapons and equipment provided intelligence about Japanese supply conditions and remaining military capabilities on other Pacific islands, where similar desperate defensive actions might be expected. Major General Roy Geiger arrived at the battlefield at 0800 hours on July 25th to conduct his personal assessment of the engagement that had effectively ended organized Japanese resistance on Guam. The general's convoy of jeeps moved slowly through the debris-strewn terrain, navigating around shell craters and the bulldozers that were already beginning the grim work of battlefield cleanup. Geiger had commanded Marine operations across the Pacific for over 2 years, but the scale of destruction visible from the road exceeded anything he had witnessed in previous island campaigns. The strategic implications of Takashina's failed assault became immediately apparent to Geiger as he studied the tactical maps updated by his intelligence staff throughout the morning. The Japanese general had committed his entire remaining force to the single desperate attack, leaving no reserve formations or fallback positions that could sustain organized resistance. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed that Japanese defensive positions across the southern portion of the island had been abandoned, with equipment destroyed and positions demolished by retreating forces who no longer possessed sufficient manpower to maintain coherent defensive lines. O'Reilly spent the morning hours writing in his field diary, attempting to process the emotional impact of the night's events, while the images remained fresh in his memory. The sergeant had participated in numerous combat actions since joining the 3rd Marine Division, but the systematic self-destruction of an entire enemy division represented something beyond conventional military experience. His entries described the surreal quality of fighting an enemy that appeared more interested in dying than in achieving any tactical objective that might contribute to overall Japanese strategy in the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Moore submitted his after-action report to division headquarters at noon, documenting the unprecedented ammunition expenditure and the tactical lessons learned from defending against a mass assault by intoxicated enemy forces. The report noted that conventional defensive planning assumed rational behavior by attacking forces, including the natural human tendency to seek cover when faced with overwhelming firepower. The alcohol factor had eliminated this assumption, requiring defensive commanders to plan for sustained combat against attackers who would continue advancing regardless of casualties or tactical futility. The intelligence analysis of captured documents revealed the extent to which Japanese command had departed from established military doctrine in planning the assault. Translation of officer diaries and unit orders showed that Takashina had explicitly ordered the distribution of sake to overcome what he termed the weakness of rational thought that might prevent soldiers from fulfilling their ultimate duty to the emperor. The strategy represented a deliberate attempt to chemically alter the mental state of attacking forces, transforming individual soldiers into components of a human weapon system designed for maximum psychological impact rather than tactical effectiveness. Medical examination of Japanese casualties provided additional insight into the effects of alcohol on combat performance and survivability. Marine corpsmen found that many enemy soldiers had continued fighting with wounds that should have been immediately fatal, apparently sustained by alcohol-induced numbness to pain and reduced awareness of their physical condition. However, the same intoxication that enabled them to ignore wounds also impaired their ability to aim accurately, take cover effectively, or coordinate tactical movements that might have given the assault some chance of success against prepared defensive positions. The ammunition resupply operation required the entire logistical capacity of the 3rd Marine Division throughout July 25th and into the following day. Artillery units had expended over 30,000 rounds in 8 hours of continuous firing, representing approximately 60% of the total ammunition stockpiled for the entire Guam campaign. The expenditure rate exceeded planning assumptions by a factor of 4, forcing logistics officers to request emergency resupply from ammunition ships that had been scheduled to support operations on other islands in the Marianas Chain. Geiger's strategic assessment concluded that the destruction of Takashina's 29th Division had effectively ended Japanese capability to conduct major offensive operations anywhere in the Pacific. The tactics employed in the Guam assault represented the final evolution of Japanese military strategy from rational defensive planning to desperate measures that sacrificed entire formations for minimal psychological impact on American forces. Intelligence estimates suggested that similar tactics might be employed on other islands where Japanese garrisons faced inevitable defeat, requiring American commanders to plan for defending against mass suicide attacks rather than conventional military operations. The psychological impact on Marine personnel became a concern for unit commanders as the full scope of the Japanese losses became apparent. Many Marines had enlisted with expectations of fighting a conventional enemy that would employ rational tactics aimed at achieving military objectives. The spectacle of thousands of enemy soldiers deliberately drinking themselves into a state of intoxication before charging into certain death challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and the limits of human behavior under extreme stress. O'Reilly's squad participated in the final sweep of the battlefield on July 26th, searching for Japanese survivors who might have escaped the initial casualty count. The Marines found evidence that some enemy soldiers had sobered during the assault and attempted to retreat or find cover, but the overwhelming majority had continued their advance until killed by American defensive fire. Empty sake bottles were discovered in Japanese positions over a mile behind the forward assault line, indicating that the alcohol distribution had been comprehensive across all units regardless of their role in the planned attack. The tactical lessons learned from the engagement would influence American defensive planning for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Military planners recognized that Japanese commanders facing inevitable defeat might resort to increasingly desperate measures that prioritize psychological impact over tactical effectiveness. The alcohol-fueled Banzai charge represented an extreme example of this evolution, demonstrating that enemy forces might continue attacking even when rational assessment would indicate the complete futility of further resistance. The strategic success of the Guam operation was confirmed when organized Japanese resistance collapsed entirely within 72 hours of Takashina's failed assault. Small groups of enemy soldiers continued to operate as isolated units in the island's interior, but their activities represented survival efforts rather than coordinated military operations. The capture of Guam provided the United States Navy with a major forward base for operations against the Japanese home islands, validating the strategic concept of island hopping that had been employed throughout the Pacific Campaign. Geiger's final report to Pacific Fleet Headquarters documented the complete destruction of Japanese military power on Guam, while acknowledging the disturbing implications of tactics that transformed individual soldiers into weapons designed for maximum psychological impact rather than military effectiveness. The general recommended that American forces prepare for similar desperate measures as the war continued toward its inevitable conclusion, recognizing that rational military planning might prove inadequate when facing an enemy willing to sacrifice entire formations in pursuit of objectives that defied conventional strategic logic.